Thank you all for coming. Many of you I know have been here for all of the weeks. It's always nice to see some new faces too. I'm super excited about this week's closing critical conversations. And with that, I will hand it over to this week's hosts, who are Kevin Perry and Greg Carling.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Kevin Perry from University of Utah, and I'm jointly doing this presentation with my colleague, Dr. Greg Carling from Brigham Young University. And we're going to be talking about why dust in the critical zone matters. And it's very interdisciplinary, and I think that you will see that we cross many of those disciplinary silos as we try and understand the significance of mineral dust in the ecosystem. I just wanted to start off with this wonderful picture of Owens Dry Lake in California. And if you don't know the history of Owens Lake, it was a vibrant ecosystem in the until the early 1900s. And then Los Angeles decided to divert all of the water for their municipal use, and they completely dried up the lake, which is hence why we call it Owens Dry Lake now. And as a result, the playa, which is the surface of the dry lake bed, started to be a significant dust source. And it's the largest dust source in North America. And the city of Los Angeles has spent billions of dollars trying to remediate this over the intervening time period.
Okay, many of you are probably familiar with the Dust Bowl in the Southern Great Plains from the 1930s. This is another one of these classic dust gone wrong sort of stories. So as settlers moved west and started farming, especially in the 1920s, they replaced the native vegetation, the native grasses, with row crops like corn and wheat. And then there were kind of some rainy years in the 1920s, and then they had some drier years in the 1930s, and they weren't able to keep these crops growing. And so all the native soils, the native vegetation that kept the soil in place just started to erode. And so we had, over the 1930s, especially starting in 1934 through about 1939, there were these massive dust storms, and all the topsoil, this rich topsoil from the Great Plains, started blowing east and ended up over New York City, Washington, D.C., and caused all sorts of economic damage. So this is another example of how humans have intervened with the natural system, and we didn't have too great of results with dust storms.
And lest you think that this is just an old problem, here is an image of a Haboob, which is a dust storm that comes from the outflow of a thunderstorm that happened recently in Phoenix, Arizona. And so that got a lot of news media attention as it dropped visibility down to less than 100 meters in places in Phoenix, and of course coated everything with this desert dust. And of course, these dust events are not just local phenomenon. They can be regional, and they can even be global. And so here we have an example of essentially the coast of Africa. And basically we have mineral dust, which is blowing off of the continent and out over the ocean. And as you'll see a little bit later on, this dust can be transported intercontinental distances, and the Saharan dust regularly makes it to South America and to North America. And we've also discovered that dust from the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan in China also make it across the Pacific and interact with and create pollution here in North America as well.
Okay, so we've been fortunate enough to have a project funded by the National Science Foundation to study dust. And as far as we know, this is one of the first projects like this, where we've had people from multiple disciplines coming together to look at dust. And so we've called our project Dust Squared, or Dust Across the Desert Urban Summit Transect. And this is part of the Critical Zone Collaborative Network that most of you are probably familiar with after attending these presentations for the last several weeks. So our team is led by Jeff Monroe from Middlebury College. And we have other investigators include Janice Brainey from Utah State University, who studies the ecological impacts of dust deposition. I'm Greg Carling from BYU. I study dust chemistry and impacts on water quality from dust. Mara Hannenberger at Salt Lake Community College studies dust modeling and transport. And then Kevin Perry, who you know now, also studies dust emissions and dust transport. And Mackenzie Skiles at the University of Utah studies the impacts of dust on snowpack. And so we'll hit on some of these topics throughout our talk today and hopefully represent the rest of our team as well. And then in addition to the 6 of us, we have a whole team of senior personnel and students who are going to be a critical part of our project over the next several years.
So just a little bit more about myself. So I am an air quality scientist, and my expertise is really in airborne particulate matter. I taught classes in atmospheric chemistry and air pollution, introduction to atmospheric sciences, and most recently I taught this really nice class that brings all of these things together. It was a class on energy, water, air, and metals, looking at sustainable use and development. And we were looking at contemporary issues that cross all of those boundaries. My research is focused primarily on long-range transport of pollutants, on mineral dust emissions, mercury contamination, looking at geochemistry, and I've also dabbled in the health effects of particulate matter. And my interest in critical zone science really began when I was working for the National Park Service. I was an air quality scientist, and we were noticing high concentrations of mineral dust in the eastern part of the United States during the summer months when the wind speeds were not particularly high, and it was a mystery to be solved. And as we worked through the geochemistry of the particulate matter in the eastern part of the United States, it matched very closely the geochemistry of the Saharan dust. And that was one of the first projects to actually demonstrate quantify the concentrations of mineral dust being transported intercontinental distances.
Hey, so I'm Greg Carling. I'm a geologist. I'm at Brigham Young University. So I'm actually started as a hydrogeologist, so you may think that's kind of a stretch to be studying dust. And some of my colleagues at BYU think that is kind of a stretch, but I'll try to explain how it all comes together a little bit. So my main research area is geochemistry. So I'm interested in dust and water geochemistry. And so I look at trace element chemistry in streams or in dust, groundwater. I'm also interested in phosphorus cycling in lakes. So at BYU, I teach classes ranging from introductory geology. So I get to work with freshman students, and then all the way up to graduate classes in contaminant hydrogeology. And so, like I said, I started off as a hydrogeologist, but before that, I went to a 4-year college in Colorado, Adams State College, where I started as a geology major. And my second or third year, I took a class in aqueous geochemistry, and that really got me excited about, I was interested in everything about geology, but that was kind of my thing. And so I ended up doing graduate school at BYU, did my master's looking at mostly a hydrogeology type project. And then during my PhD at the University of Utah, I started meeting with, or going to talks and meeting with people from different disciplines. And we had some speakers come in to talk about dust. And I was kind of like, all right, this is this is really cool. And a lot of them were looking at dust in alpine areas. And that was one of my interests. And so it was around that time where I first started to learn about critical zone science. So I was well into my PhD. And that's kind of where I thought, okay, this is something great, critical zone science, but also dust. It kind of brings all of these things I'm interested in together. And so luckily I was able to pursue some of that towards the end of my PhD. And then since I got a position at BYU, I've been able to follow up with a lot of dust research spanning about 10 years now. And I would say, as far as getting into a career, like I never expected that I'd be a professor. As an undergraduate student, that never even crossed my mind. It really was mentors along the way that kind of encouraged me to keep going the next step for master's and then for a PhD. And then I'm very fortunate for where I ended up today, but I could have ended up in a lot of other places easily. That's just the way things fell. So I really enjoy learning about dust, and I hope that some of you will catch some of our excitement, because it's one of the few things that really brings together all the different parts of the Earth system. I mean, water does the same thing, but dust is kind of analogous to that in that it connects the atmosphere, obviously, with transported dust and air quality. It connects the biosphere by linking or transporting things like microbes or pollen across large distances. We have to know something about the lithosphere and how the types of rocks can control the dust composition and dust erosion. The pedosphere, with soil development, cryosphere with dust on snow, and also the hydrosphere, because water controls where dust can get emitted. If we have water in some place, we're probably not going to get dust. But also dust getting into a watershed can affect water quality. And then kind of the big picture of this is that dust links spatially distant parts of the critical zone. And so we could have dust from a desert area traveling tens to hundreds, even thousands of kilometers and impacting a critical zone, or maybe a watershed that you're studying in an alpine area or a tropical rainforest. And so there's just linking distal parts of the critical zone, but also bringing together the Earth system. This is really what gets me excited about dust.
So I just wanted to give a quick example of dust emission from playas and how it can have an impact on air quality and how that relates to human development. So on the left, we have a picture of the Great Salt Lake. There is, around the margin of the Great Salt Lake, is a whole bunch of exposed playa. There's more than 750 square miles. And that's due in part to a combination of water diversion for agricultural and municipal use, and also in part due to drought. A study from Utah State University has determined that the water diversions have reduced the lake's surface by 11 feet, and that the drought that we're in right now has reduced it another 4 feet beyond that. And what I have here is a time-lapse image of a video from Salt Lake City from the University of Utah looking out to the west. The Great Salt Lake is in the right of this picture, and we have a cold front that's coming through and is picking up dust off of the Great Salt Lake and moving it into the population area. This particular dust storm ended up reducing the visibility at the airport to less than 2 miles and got a lot of people's attention. So this is kind of a preview of the breakout session, which I'll be leading, which is looking at dust generation and transport. And there are really 3 major classifications of controls of these dust emissions. Some of those are purely geological in terms of the particle size distributions, the amount of silting clay, and the surface crust. Some of them are meteorological. You need strong winds in order for the dust to be liberated from the surface. And there are lots of different mechanisms that can generate those strong winds. And then we also have the humans interacting with the landscape and altering the landscape, as Greg had been talking about with the Dust Bowl from the 1930s. Those activities, grazing, agriculture, water diversion, and recreation, off-road vehicles, all of those have an impact on the surface and can lead to local and regional dust emissions and subsequent transport. So why do we care about dust in the atmosphere and those linkages from one local region to a far off region? Well, I've already indicated that it significantly reduces visibility. On the top left, we have pictures from China of dust from the Gobi Desert and how that's impacted the visibility. When that dust comes off of the continent of Africa, the dust there has some components that actually absorb solar radiation, and it warms the atmosphere. And as it warms the atmosphere, it changes the stability, changes the vertical temperature structure. And if you have a lot of dust over the Atlantic, it actually reduces the number and severity of hurricanes. So there's a linkage between the land and the storms out over the ocean. Depending upon the mineralogy of the dust, some of those dust particles can act as ice nuclei, and ice nuclei are really important in the atmosphere. They're actually very rare, but in order for clouds to form precipitation, these ice crystals help facilitate that precipitation. So if you have more dust in the atmosphere, it can actually enhance precipitation in some areas. As Greg mentioned, we can transport biological material and pollutants. They can be transported intercontinental scales. And due to the nature of the dust itself, it can sometimes buffer acid rain and make it less intrusive on the ecosystems. And of course, as the ultimate receptors, the humans, when we breathe in this dust, it's known to be an inhalation hazard and is essentially regulated as particulate matter by the EPA. And so there are concentrations of dust which will have noticeable impacts on human health.
All right, and then once this dust that's transported through the atmosphere ends up on the land surface, we get a whole host of other impacts. And this is where I'm most interested in studying dust, and also several members of our Dust Squared team. So dust can affect the water chemistry of alpine streams, especially where you have in mountains where maybe there's not a lot of other sources of elements or contaminants, and dust can bring in these like lead and arsenic and other metals from the deserts deposited in the mountains and ends up in our water. And then one of the major impacts that a lot of people are interested in is looking at dust on snowpack. And the dust actually lowers the albedo or increases the amount of solar radiation that the snowpack takes in, causes snow to melt earlier, darkens the surface, causes it to melt earlier. Can contribute to eutrophication of mountain lakes. So dust contains nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, or these fertilizers that end up in some remote places, and they can cause eutrophication or cause lakes to grow algae or excessive amounts of algae that otherwise would not be there. Dust can also aid in soil development. So here's this picture down here shows on the bottom left, shows a soil profile from the Uinta Mountains in Utah, where we have a very poorly developed soil, but the top maybe 20 centimeters is pretty much made up of dust that's accumulated over the past several thousand years since glaciers left the mountains. Biologists are interested in dust as well, because as dust lands on the surface, it can change the local ecology, because we have hitchhikers like bacteria or other microbes, or even seeds or pollen that can travel long distances and change the ecology of the watershed where it lands. And then one of the major kind of benefits of dust is that it fertilizes the rainforest. So there have been many studies that have shown that without the Saharan dust, the Amazon rainforest wouldn't be nearly as productive because of the nutrients that are transported across the Atlantic and end up in the Amazon basin. So there's several different ways that we can look at dust, and I'll start off with some in situ measurements of dust. These are some of the tools that we use to track dust and identify these impacts. And then we'll give a few other examples of tools, and then that'll be the end of our presentation. So some of these in situ measurements of dust include very simple things like in the upper right here, a marble collector. So we have a marble that simulates a rough surface so that dust can actually accumulate and not just blow away. But we oftentimes will leave out these marble type collectors. We collect wet and dry deposition, and then eventually we end up with, if we're lucky, a few hundred milligrams of dust that we can then work with. On the left-hand side here, we have a dust trap that we put at dust emission sources. So this is a dry lake bed or playa in western Utah. And this is a trap that orients into the wind. So when the wind blows, this thing will line up with the wind direction and collect dust. So you can see we have multiple levels. The bottom little traps will collect the saltating dust, and the upper traps will maybe collect the finer fraction that is more likely to travel longer distances. And then in the bottom right, we have an active sampler that's actually pulling in air and running it through a filter so that we can collect a small dust sample. And these active samplers, the advantage is sometimes you only have to leave them out there for a day or a couple of weeks to get material, as opposed to these marble collectors that you usually have to leave out for months to get enough material to do something with.
So in addition to in situ measurements, we also make use of remote sensing to study dust. And we can look at dust emissions on local, regional, and global scales with these satellites, depending upon the types of satellites. So in the upper left, we actually have a image that is showing the scale of individual agricultural fields. This happens to be data from some CubeSats, which were recently launched, and they have a 3-meter resolution at the surface. And from that vantage point, with the 3-meter resolution, you can not only see that this is coming from agricultural areas, you can actually see which parts of the agricultural areas are emitting dust. And that's one of the things that we learned very quickly about dust, is that the emission itself is very heterogeneous and depends critically upon local conditions at varying scales from hundreds of meters down to tens of meters. Once this dust gets lofted, it can then be tracked by satellite as well. In the middle, we actually have a very large dust storm that happened in 1998. And it happened to be the very first time that we were able to track an Asian dust event as it traversed the Pacific Ocean and came into the Western United States. So outlined in yellow are kind of the locations of that dust plume on subsequent days. And then these same satellites can also look at the optical depth, or essentially the impact that these aerosols have on the vertical transmission of radiation in the atmosphere. And you can do that on seasonal timescales, monthly, seasonal, or even annual, to get an idea of what the dust load actually is in the atmosphere. And that's what you see in the lower right-hand corner.
Okay, and then another tool we can use to look at dust once we have some kind of a dust sample in hand is laboratory measurements. And a lot of these laboratory measurements have the goal of kind of fingerprinting the dust to look at where the dust came from and to try to track from source to sink. But beyond fingerprints, we also care about what's in the dust because there's impacts on health or ecosystems or water quality. So a couple of examples of the types of measurements we can make on dust include isotope measurements. So this plot on the left shows it's a plot of neodymium and strontium isotopes. And these are useful for fingerprinting the source of dust. And so if we have a dust sample collected at a receptor site, we can then compare that to maybe a library of dust sources and say, okay, this dust came from maybe an Asian dust source or a Saharan dust source or a local dust source. On the right, you can see, this is kind of beyond me, but this is some microbial data that one of my colleagues collected from dust. And we can also see that depending on where the dust came from, it's going to have a different microbial signature. And so we can maybe use that as a fingerprint as well for dust sources. And then as this dust lands on the ecosystem, it's going to have all sorts of impacts, bringing this kind of these far-traveled bacteria to a watershed.
And then other things that it's really good to learn as a student is statistical analysis. Very common computer programming languages. A lot of my students always basically resist learning a computer programming language. And I really want to strongly encourage you to move beyond your initial reluctance, because they're very powerful and allow you to do a lot of interesting analysis that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Common computer programming languages for data analysis are MATLAB, Python, and R. Another type of statistical analysis is principal component analysis or positive matrix factorization. And what these do is basically take a large either time series or a large agglomeration of data, and it will look for bivariate correlations among the different analytes in your data stream. And it will determine which one of these are essentially covariant with each other. And the ones that are covariant with each other are identified as coming from essentially a common source. And it's another way to look at source fingerprinting at a receptor site as opposed to a source fingerprinting from the actual geochemistry and microbial data that Greg was talking about. And lastly, if we want to try and understand the impacts of dust transport emissions, computer modeling is our friend. And the basic way that we go about that is we run numerical weather prediction models in order to generate the winds that we need in order to run our dust emission model. And the numerical weather prediction models, we have the weather research and forecasting model, the WRF, the high resolution rapid return model, the HRR, the global forecast system, the EWN-CF, which is the European model. There's lots of different models out there that can give us those winds. And then we have to have a model of the actual processes that generate the dust. And a lot of previous research has identified saltation, sandblasting, and creep as mechanisms by which you can get a horizontal flux that's then lifted into a vertical flux of dust. And then once you have that dust that has been suspended in the atmosphere, you use those numerical weather prediction models, feed that into regional chemical transport models or global climate models to determine where that dust is eventually going to end up and the impacts that it has on the radiation transfer in the atmosphere, the impacts that it has on clouds, and ultimately the total amount of material that is deposited at remote ecosystems via either dry deposition or wet deposition. And that concludes our introduction to why dust matters in the critical zone.
Awesome. So what we're going to do, as per usual, is we're going to head into some breakout rooms. Thank you for a fantastic presentation that was super helpful and insightful and easy to follow. So the breakout rooms, when you registered, you signed up for a room, although you are more than willing to switch, and you may be more interested in moving into some of the dust transport and dust and water chemistry sections after that talk. But the sessions that you would have registered for, we'll put you in that room. If you don't want to be in that room, just pop back out and Julia will help move you if you can't move yourself, which with the newest version of Zoom, you should be able to. Your rooms, your room choices are an introduction to dust transport, an introduction to dust and water chemistry, the challenges of being a woman in STEM, advice on applying and being a graduate student, working on collaborative teams, and finally, mentoring and networking. So we will open these up here. You will be assigned to your room. Again, feel free to move as you see fit, and we'll see you in those rooms, and then we'll pull back into the main room for just the last minute to close everything out. And that will be the plan of attack. So with that, Julia, would you be willing to open some rooms?